So in this video, we're going to be covering some basic spatial concepts from the realm of geography before we get started in our software. So the main concepts for this video are a vector model of space and its corresponding three vector geometries, knowing what a layer versus a feature is, and finally understanding what attribute data is. Okay, so and in this video we're going to be talking about two main topics, which are how do we represent space on a computer, and finally how do we organize what we want to represent. Okay, let's get started. So we're going to start out by talking about a vector model of space. And a vector model uses three different basic geometry types to represent everything that we could and would want to represent in a map. So those three geometries are a point, a line, and a polygon. So let's think for a second about the different kinds of features that we could represent with each of these three. So you notice a line is usually something that has a fixed location, and depending on the scale of the map you're looking at, doesn't really have dimensions of length or width. So for example, if you were looking at, say, a map of your hometown, a point could be used to represent maybe the center of town or the location of households or businesses. And using this same example, if you wanted to represent things with a line, it would be things that only had one dimension of length. It didn't really have a dimension of width. So normally we represent things like roads and rivers using lines. And then finally we have polygons. So polygons are things that have both a dimension of width and of length. So for example, we could represent the town boundaries, we could represent a certain parcel of land, maybe a field. And you can notice that each of these three geometry types builds off of the other. So a line segment is made up of 2 points that are connected, and a polygon is made up of 3 or more connected line segments. And even though these three geometry types seem very basic, and they are, we can represent just about anything we could want to using these three geometries. So how do we digitize an actual landscape? And by digitizing, I mean, how are we taking an actual landscape and representing it in a digital format on a computer? So to show how we do this, I'm going to start out with what I'm going to call a baby landscape. And I'm calling this a baby landscape because it's a simplified, easy example and we'll use for understanding these concepts. So you can see we just have a very basic landscape. We've got some grass in the background, we've got trees, we've got a river, and we've got a lake right over here. How would we represent these three features using a vector model of space? So we'd start out with our background map, which here is the grass. And then we would add on, let's start with the trees. Now, the trees would probably be best as points because they don't, in this case, really have much of a length or a width. They're in a set position. So we could digitize those using points, like so. And the river we'd probably digitize using a line because it has a dimension of length. It doesn't really have much of width. And then finally, we would digitize the lake as a polygon because we've got both length and width, and we've got an area within that. So you see how we can take an actual landscape and create a one-to-one model using vector. So once again, we've got our three features, our tree, our river, and our lake, and we've digitized them by turning them respectively. So the tree into a point, we turned the river into a line, and the lake into a polygon. So you'll hear me referring to features a lot throughout the videos. So a feature is anything that we're choosing to digitize, choosing to turn to represent using a vector model of space in our map. So if we have a whole bunch of features, and normally we'll have maps that are more complicated than the baby landscape I just showed you, what can we do to organize these different features into logical categories? And the way we do this in geography, especially through spatial technology, is we organize our features into what we call layers. Organizing our features into layers allows for easier spatial analysis because you can isolate a single layer and examine just its features, and it makes it easier to create visually pleasing maps because you can change how all the features of a layer are displayed at once rather than having to change each feature individually. So let's say for this example, I wanted to create two different layers, and I wanted one layer to show me vegetation, and I wanted the other layer to show me bodies of water. So I could take all of my points, my trees, and put them on a vegetation layer. And then I could take my river and my lake and bring those into a bodies of water layer. So let's see how that would look if we've got the actual features on the layer. So once again, we've got our base map. And then on top of that, we could put our vegetation layer, which are with our 4 points representing the trees. And then on top of that, we could put our bodies of water layer with our river and our lake. And if we put those all together and we looked at the final version, we'd get something that looks like this. So we would be able to see our base layer underneath these two layers, but we'd have our 4 points for our tree, our line representing our river, and our polygon representing our lake. So for another level of organization, let's take a look at what are attributes. So real quick, let's go, remember our golf course example from the first video? Remember how we were navigating around and we had a whole bunch of different features. If we look more closely at that map, and you can go back and look at it if you like, each of these different features was organized into its own layer. So each of the fairways had a layer, each of the tees had a layer. I think the river and the other bodies of water had their own layer. But do you remember what happened when we clicked on the tees? We got something that looked like this, and this gave us some nice extra info that we took a look at. And this extra info are called its attributes. So this is kind of an extra level of organization where we can attribute additional descriptive data to a feature. So in Google Maps Engine, this data can be displayed in two different ways. So first, when you simply click on the feature, when you get this handy little pop-up that we talked about. And second, you can find it in the map's data table. So we'll see this once we get to the next video and take a look at the data table. But see how all of this information that we have attributed to a single feature is also, it's the same information here, but just organized in a spreadsheet. So this is a way in which we can not only create features and represent the space around us, but we can tell the viewer what those features actually mean. We can give descriptions to them, and we can organize additional data. Okay, so real quick, let's go back to the schema so we can get an overall view of how we're going to be organizing our maps. So if we start out with a basic map, each map is going to be made up of usually several layers. Remember again, base map, vegetation layer, and bodies of water layer. I'm going back to our baby landscape for an example. And then each layer is going to be made up of several different features. So in the case of the vegetation layer, it was made up of 4 points, each representing a tree. And then each of these features will have an additional layer of organization, which will be its attribute. So in this case, if I wanted to say that this particular tree was not just any tree, but a white pine or a Pinus strobus, I could give it additional attribute data. So notice how each of these levels of organization are nested and how they all fit together to give us a map that has many different layers of organization and allows us to create a nuanced and visually effective analysis. Okay, and this is everything for this video, and I will see you in the next.